Thank you so much. My name is Courtney Radge. I'm with the Committee to Protect Journalists. And I have a specific question if you can talk about the law enforcement threats to journalists and to lawyers who really depend on the ability to discuss in confidentiality with their sources or their clients. And I think that the issue you raised about pushing out malware is a real one. If you remember in Dubai, the government-owned telecom pushed out malware to our BlackBerries. I was working as a journalist there. And we only knew about it because foreign reporters who weren't working in a repressive country were able to report on it. So that's a really important dynamic. But the ACLU and Human Rights Watch did a very important report, and I just think it's important to raise the specific threats to to lawyers and journalists and hear about those threats.
I mean, I'll let Jack answer in a second because I think you probably have your own thoughts. But I'll just say that one of the great things that's happened post Snowden is that journalists are now starting to take digital security seriously, and the use of email encryption is now widespread among national security reporters. I think that definitely wasn't the case 2 years ago, and in some cases I had to help people, and my friends and colleagues had to help people. But I think the journalism community has really come a long way. The legal community has not yet come in that direction. Still, the number of encrypted emails I get from lawyers who don't work for the ACLU is very, very small. The number of legal organizations who encrypt their websites, who offer encrypted telephone services to their clients is very, very small. And sadly, lawyers don't seem to do anything until failure to do so is deemed to be unethical action. And so what we really need is for the ABA, the American Bar Association, or the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers to put out statements saying that lawyers need to encrypt. Lawyers need to use email encryption, use telephone encryption. But the journalism community is moving in the right direction. I think the main problem right now is that still many of the tools that we have are not very easy to use. And so text message and voice encryption are basically idiot-proof at this point. And that, I'm really happy with where things are going there. But email encryption is still a nightmare, and sharing encrypted documents between reporters is still very, very difficult.
Right, and just very briefly on this, because I wanted to ask Orin, by proxy, a question, is, the Snowden disclosures and national security is but one very small area in sensitive reporting that journalists do all over the country and all over the world. I mean, at minimum, I've talked to sources at state governments, companies, private firms outside of the intelligence community where, they may not go to jail, they may not face 20 to life or something for disclosing this, but they have a mortgage to pay, they have bills to pay, they have a family to feed. And, worst case scenario, journalists, as you point out, in hostile countries, here, I'm lucky to live in a country where maybe the worst that happens to me is, not saying it's a walk in the park, I get held in contempt. We're talking about people dying and disappearing. If this information is made out, sources of ours who disappear in the middle of the night because a government intercepts it. And the question I had when we talk about lawyers, I'm just curious from a legal perspective, is what this surveillance means for attorney-client privilege, and how when the government sort of does this mass surveillance, how that's protected and how that works.
It totally depends on which mass surveillance you have in mind, and so it's sort of a hard question to answer. I will say on the journalism question, I think, to my mind, there's been a little too much emphasis by the press on how victimized the press is by investigations that involve leaks to the press. The press is very good at defending its interests in such cases where, we have the basic problem, it seems to me, is that leaking national security secrets to the press is a crime, and so naturally the government is going to investigate the leak, and then the reporters on the other end of that leak, and so it creates, the reporters getting awfully close to the crime, right? So it is a question, how does the government investigate those cases? Some would say the government should not investigate those cases, that should not be a crime, but if we accept that that is a crime and should be a crime, which I think is the only way to have a classified system where we have some secrets that are classified, which should be the case, then naturally reporters are going to get close to that. And I think there's been some miscoverage of investigations in which, I guess it was the affidavit in which an AP reporter was described as somebody who committed an offense. And that got totally blown out of proportion. It was really a phrase that was required under a statutory authority, the Privacy Protection Act, and a Justice Department approval process that did not mean that the reporter was targeted. It just meant that there was a part of a checklist that had to be covered and a language that ended up in an affidavit. So I'm not totally convinced that these are as severe problems as the question suggested, but at least in the attorney-client privilege question, it just totally depends on the nature of the surveillance.
I definitely have a slightly different view, and yes, Julian, I will be brief. We absolutely need to have an ironclad shield law for journalists, certainly at the federal level. I would argue at every level. And if you want a poster child for why, just take a look at the Jim Rising case. It is an excellent example. It's hardly the only one. But my problem with essentially making an argument that we need to have wide latitude, essentially, for prosecutors to be able to go after folks in cases like this is that the only reason we know that unconstitutional surveillance has been conducted against each and every one of us is because of Edward Snowden being willing to go to folks in the business that Jack and others are in. And we need to be able to find ways, ironclad ways, I think, to make sure that those journalists are essentially untouchable when they're doing their reportage on this. And that, to me, is the great vulnerability we have in the law right now.